Greetings, fellow painters, Trahane here. Today we paint Banner Spear for your Frosthaven board game, and I'll explain why I will never again paint non-metallic metal on a 28mm miniature. We start with a miniature that's been primed in black and get to work right away, basing all the flesh areas in some whole red. I am going to cover the entire face area with one coat of whole red, and I will layer up a second coat, avoiding the eyes and deepest recesses with that second coat. This is a fine time to base the right hand of the miniature in whole red as well. I had somehow missed the fact that the right hand of this character, the one that is holding the falcon, is not wearing a glove. I'm also going to add some whole red to the entire bird. I do not have a plan for how I'm going to paint the bird at this time, but I figure it's going to be some sort of browns and neutral colors, and the whole red should be a good foundation for that. We are going to layer up the Banner Spear skin with some barbarian flesh, thinned a little bit with water, and we're going to apply this in a couple of thin coats, and we're going to leave the deepest recesses and shadows, such as the eye socket and lower part of the right side of the face, pure whole red. We will continue to layer up the skin by adding elven flesh thinned a bit with water. This will be done in a couple coats, covering less area with each coat until we're finally just dotting little highlights on the tip of the nose, top of the cheek, and forehead. And now that we have the Banner Spear looking like she's suffering some sort of anaphylactic reaction, we're going to grab some Flesh Wash by Vallejo and just glaze that in and bring down the elven flesh highlights just a bit and allow them to blend a little more smoothly into the barbarian flesh and then into the whole red in some of the darker areas. And then we are very sparingly going to reapply some elven flesh in a little stippling motion just to apply the highest highlights to the model. And don't forget to do all of these steps for the right hand as well, as I did, and now I have to do it as an afterthought. Craft paint time. We're going to take some burnt umber, burnt sienna, and start applying it to all of the large fur components of the miniature as well as to the miniature's base. And we are also going to apply a base coat of burnt umber to the banner on the model's back. It's funny, I actually painted my first 75 models with these cheap Artist Loft paints. They all weren't winners, but I did find a couple of the colors that I really like using. This burnt sienna, for example, has a nice little orange hue to it, and I think that is going to contrast or complement nicely with the blue banners on this model. It also dries much less intense than when it's first applied, making layering up with it or dry brushing with it very easy. Now a quick timeout to check some reference art and decide what color to paint that banner on the back of the model. I decided to go with a bright orange, so this banner gets a base coat of the burnt umber as well. And I'm also going to hit the leather components, such as the straps around the chest and waist, with burnt umber. Time to continue layering up the thick fur with the blend of burnt umber and burnt sienna. This mix will be applied with a heavy dry brush or wet brush technique, and we will start picking out the raised areas of the fur. And since I still have no plan for the bird, I'm going to slap some of this paint on there and just hope that something from my palette inspires me. In case you were wondering what those first 75 models that I painted with this cheap craft paint was, it was called Magic the Gathering Arena of the Planeswalkers Shadows over Innistrad. I bought a couple of clearance copies of it just to practice my miniature painting. That game is definitely a mouthful to say. The miniatures were okay, but I cut my teeth with the miniature painting hobby with those. We are continuing the highlighting process by adding pure burnt sienna to a smaller area of the heavy fur, and I think I'm going to add this as another little base layer to that bright orange banner on the back of the miniature. And then adding some pure white to the burnt sienna will give us our final highlight color. And of course, I'm still lost on the bird, so I am going to add some of this to the central part of the wings. I will apply this in a couple of passes on the fur, finally culminating with just a few little dots of intense highlight. Once I complete that, I am going to go back to the bird's wings with some red wash and just try to add some separation to that light white and burnt sienna highlight. Let's lay down some orange-brown on the collar of the miniature. The recessed areas will be treated very lightly with this color, whereas the raised areas will get multiple coats and build up the opacity. We will choose the color Buff by Vallejo as the highlight color for the collar. This will be applied in a very controlled manner, and we will start picking out individual strands of fur around the head of the miniature. Be sure to allow some of that brown-orange color to show through. Following this, we will add a little bit of titanium white to the buff and pick out just a few final highlights on the collar. The mix of titanium white and buff will also be used to base coat the bird's chest and head. Even though I still have no frickin' idea what I'm doing with this bird, I am happy with the choice of color for the chest and head. Next, we are going to go back to the red wash and glaze in some shadow color to the deep recesses and edges of the collar. We will also apply the red wash to add some depth to the heavy fur area on the cloak. For the spear handles, we will use some baby poop yellow craft paint and paint just highlights on the brown base of the spear handles. Here it shows that I'm also applying this to the handles on the back spears, however I go back and paint over those brown. The yellow ochre will also be applied to the lashings that hold the spears on the banner spear's back. I will also dry brush this over the handle of the sword and the bottom of the scarab in order to start the base of a non-metallic metal finish. However, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this since it is on the back of the model, so it will all be completed with just a series of dry brushes covering smaller and smaller amounts of area with brighter and brighter paint. The yellow ochre is the only color that I will use to build up the highlights on the shaft of the spear and the lashings on the back of the miniature. We will use Lava Orange by Army Painter to start building up layers of color on the banner on the back of the miniature. At this point, we're really just hitting the raised areas, allowing the burnt sienna and burnt umber to still show through. Because of how translucent this orange is, we could build up a couple of layers before moving on to a more intense highlight with titanium white added to the Lava Orange. I actually spend a little bit of time building up the highlights on this banner, not because it's an important aspect of the sculpture, but more just to differentiate it from the oranges that are present in the furs and on the bird. And then we dip into the red wash again to add some depth and shadow to the underside of the cloth as well as the inside fold of the banner. With that all wrapped up, we're going to move on to adding some more craft paint to the base of the miniature. We're going to start with some burnt umber, followed by some baby poop yellow, also known as ochre yellow. We are not going to be too meticulous about this. We're just trying to add some color to the base, as we are going to put a snow effect over the top of it when we're all done. Fur Brown by Army Painter is the color that we'll choose to highlight all of the leather elements on the miniature. This includes the chest strap, the waist straps, and the glove on the left hand. Initially, the fur brown will be added just to lighten and highlight the leather somewhat, but later, when we add titanium white to the mix, it will be applied in little stipple motions and scratches to make the leather look somewhat worn, and we'll use it to dot in some final highlights. And of course, I might as well throw this final highlight color over the bird as a dry brush to see if it finally inspires me to choose a specific color scheme for the bird. It doesn't. Before moving on to the blue cloth of this model, I want to finish up the sword, the scabbard, and it looks like there are two metal rings on the front right waist of the banner spear. At this point, I am all done with the yellow ochre, and I'm jumping right into using some demonic yellow by Army Painter. I am no longer taking a dry brush approach to the sword handle or the scabbard like I did with the yellow ochre. I am applying very controlled highlights. This goes pretty quickly because these are basically just edge highlights. There isn't a lot of blending or glazing, though once I do bring up the highlights pretty far, I do go back and glaze a little demonic yellow over portions of this metal, and I do finish also with one dot of titanium white just to add little glints of light. Finally, we pick up some ultramarine blue by Army Painter and get to work on the banner and all of the cloth around the banner spear's waist. We're going to cover all of the cloth in this color, however we're not going for complete opacity. We want some of the dark black hue to still show through in the deep recesses as well as the back of the banner. In fact, on the back of the banner we will only apply one coat of this color and we will not highlight it at all. We will continue this until every piece of cloth is covered with one coat of paint. Then we'll go back to the start, applying a second coat of the ultramarine blue, only now we will be selecting where we place the paint. We will be actively avoiding any of the deepest recesses and of course the back of the banner. I have decided to highlight the model as if the light is coming from the model's top left side. Therefore, the banner itself is going to catch the most light and have the most highlights. When I am ready to start highlighting the base color, I'm going to add some Void Shield Blue to Ultramarine Blue in a 50-50 mix and get to work stippling the highlights on the model. The stippling adds a nice texture to the fabric rather than having it look ultra smooth. I also realized later that I'm basically just highlighting all of the raised areas perfectly evenly, and it's not a very realistic effect. Later in the process, I do go back to some Ultramarine Blue and glaze in some shadows. And since we're talking about glaze here, I feel like I need to clarify the terms glaze and wash, especially since I used them together earlier when I said that we're going to glaze in some red wash. But before we talk about that, let's start stippling in some pure Void Shield Blue. So glazing is a technique where you have a heavily thinned paint mixture, either thinned with medium or thinned with water, and most of the paint will be wicked off the brush, and then you will apply a thin layer over an existing coat of paint just to slightly tint it. Whereas a wash is a similar but perhaps slightly thinner consistency, and it's applied liberally over the surface of a model that will slightly tint the raised surfaces and pull in the recesses to create deep shadows. So that is a brief description of those two techniques, but there is also a wash product, which is what I was using earlier. I took the red wash product, removed most of it from my brush, and just applied it to tint the raised surfaces that I wanted to color. I did not allow it to pool in the recesses to create shadows, other than when I did this intentionally on the bird's wings and some areas of the heavy fur. And here I am glazing in the ultramarine blue as promised. I am hitting the deep recesses to add some shadow. I'm also glazing the banner's left side, so our right, to knock down some of those highlights on the downward facing folds on the left side of the banner. So the right side, as we look at it, I took out some of those highlights. I then revisit, adding a few highlights, and then we move on to the non-metallic metal. For all of the non-metallic metal armor, I'll be using just 4 colors: Deep Blue by Army Painter, Glacier Blue by Vallejo, a matte black, and a matte white. I started out by dotting in some matte white on the armor on the arms just to map out where I wanted the brightest highlights. Then I proceeded with a layer up technique where I started with a mix of deep blue and matte black covering most of each armor panel, then switching to just deep blue covering a little bit less of each army panel, and I would do a couple coats of each of these before moving on to the next lightest element. So after the plain deep blue, I'd do deep blue and glacier blue, followed by just glacier blue, mix of glacier blue and matte white, and I will finish the painting process with just a few dots of pure matte white, just where I want little glints of light on the armor. I will occasionally go back and glaze in the 2 darker colors, the mix of dark blue and matte black. The lightest I'm going to go with glazing over the non-metallic metal parts would be using just the pure deep blue. And this is my last time doing non-metallic metal on a model this small, unless of course it has much larger metal characteristics such as a large shield, maybe a broadsword, something like that I could actually, something that has more surface area to work with. These tiny armor panels on the shoulders and elbow and chest plate are just far too small for me to try to get in there and do any type of smooth glazing non-metallic metal look. The forearms actually was pretty good to work with, but the rest of it just wasn't worth it. And even the edges, doing the edge highlighting on those shoulder pieces, they weren't as pronounced as they might look, and they weren't as pronounced as I thought they were going to be. So even edge highlighting those was kind of a pain in the butt. Maybe I just need to use a better brush. I have purchased recently a Winsor Newton Series 7, I believe, Kolinsky Sable brush, which should work better than these synthetic brushes that I'm using in this video. Maybe it would have allowed me to enjoy the process more. And that's really the crux of it. I'm all about enjoying the process of painting. I'm less about the end result, the end goal. With this brush, on a model this small, I just wasn't quite enjoying the process of painting, and perhaps a brush with a better tip would alleviate that. I'm also not sure if the non-metallic metal effect is worth it on a miniature this small. In these close-ups, when I'm all done, it will read as if it's metal, but on the table at a distance, I'm not sure there's any real benefit to this over using a traditional metallic paint and shading it. Fortunately, many of the miniatures that I paint for board games are by Kaman, and they tend to use a 32mm scale, which doesn't sound like it would be that much larger than 28mm, but it does make a significant difference when you're painting the model. So I guess the good news is that I'll still have plenty of opportunity to develop and improve my non-metallic metal painting technique as I continue my journey in the miniature painting hobby. I begin painting the hair by applying some Alien Purple by Army Painter around all the places on the hair where I think it'll catch the most light, such as a little halo around the top of the head, the top of the ponytail, the curve at the bottom of the ponytail, and I color one strand that runs along the left side of her face. And then I highlight these purple areas with a mix of Alien Purple and Matte White by Army Painter. Notice that the wingtips on the bird have some color now. I decided to base those in Necromancer Cloak by the Army Painter, and then I've dry brushed a highlight over them using Ash Gray, also by Army Painter. After we apply the final highlights to the hair, all that's left to do is paint the rim in a matte black before applying a matte clear coat to protect the model. Lastly, we're going to DIY some snow for the base of the model. We're going to use some baking soda, a thick, cheap craft paint in white, and some PVA school glue. We're going to put equal parts of the glue, paint, and baking soda into a small dish and give it a good mix before applying it to the model. I'm going to grab a crappy brush, which is easy because all my brushes are crappy, and I'm going to dab the mixture onto the base of the model, hitting all of the high areas and leaving some of the low ground areas showing through, particularly around the base of the rocks. And that wraps up painting the banner spear for your Frosthaven board game. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and be sure to check out one of my other videos.